Welcome to the first episode of Tiny Show and Tell Us. I'm Sam Jones. I'm the exec producer of Tiny Matters, and I'm here with my wonderful co-host, Deboki Chakravarti. Deboki, how's it going?
Good. I'm excited to do this. We've been talking about this for a while, and so I'm so excited to actually be sitting down and going through things that people sent us.
Me too. Finally making it happen. For those of you listening who are not regular Tiny Matters listeners, first off, we're glad you're here. Second, there's this thing that we do at the end of every regular Tiny Matters episode called the Tiny Show and Tell. And so in that, Deboki and I each bring a piece of science news or a story that we recently read, and we share it with each other. And now we want you to share with us, hence the name Tiny Show and Tell Us.
So for these bonus episodes, send an email to tinymatters@acs.org with a science story, some science news you can't stop thinking about, maybe a science factoid, and we'll read it aloud and then we're going to dive a bit deeper into it. So that's tinymatters@acs.org. We'll put that in the episode description as well.
And before we get into things, a huge thank you to Anne Hilden for doing research this episode. Anne is a science writer and chemist who's working with Tiny Matters for the next few months. Okay, Deboki, should we do this?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so I'm going to go first because I want to start things off on a pretty light, silly note.
Cool.
Our first Tiny Show and Tell Us is from listener Dakota, who wrote in saying, "My fave science fact is that parrotfish eat coral and poop out calcium carbonate, which is what white sand beaches are made of. Your favorite beaches are poop." Thank you, Dakota.
I mean, but isn't everything poop?
Yeah. It all comes back to poop, really.
Yeah.
So first I want to say, I had no idea that sand was really about size more than anything. So if more than 50% of the material is larger in diameter than 75 microns, which is about 0.03 inches, but smaller than 0.18 inches, it's sand. It's that simple. Huh. I don't know.
Where do they get the size? Where were they like, this is the cutoff that makes sense?
They just said, we're going with it. And so
okay.
I guess if the average particle size is smaller, it's considered silt or clay. And then if it's bigger, it's gravel.
Huh.
So not directly related to this, but I just thought that was a really a weird and kind of fun thing.
Yeah.
So what sand is actually made of really depends on where you are and what minerals are around. A lot of beaches are a tan color. I think, growing up in the New England area, we don't have white sand beaches, at least to my knowledge.
No parrotfish poop in our beaches out.
No. They're mostly like a tannish color. And that comes from a combo of iron oxide and a group of minerals called feldspar, which is cool. And then black beaches are black from obsidian, which is a volcanic glass that forms when lava comes out of a volcano, cools really rapidly. Just a little more on sand and beaches. But today we're obviously focused on white sand beaches and parrotfish. So parrotfish are a group of fish species. They're not, I always think it's a type of fish, but it's actually a bunch of different species. And they're pretty decently sized. They're generally around 12 to 20 inches long. That's not a small fish, but some can grow to over a meter long, which is pretty impressive. Yeah. And so what they do is they eat algae off of dead coral or rocks, but their beak-like mouths end up taking bites of the coral as well. And I guess Anne found that the green humphead parrotfish, one of the largest species, eats live coral polyps too. So as they digest this nutritious stuff, this algae that they're getting off the dead coral, they're also grinding up the inedible calcium carbonate coral skeletons in their guts. And then they're excreting it as sand. So that's how that works. And apparently that humphead parrotfish can produce 90 kilograms, which is around 200 pounds of sand each year.
200. Sorry, you said from one fish?
Yes.
It sounds like a lot when it's sand, but it's even more when you realize it's poop.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah.
Of course, inevitably leads to the question of how much does the average human poop in a year?
Oh, it's so much.
Yeah, I'm sitting here judging the parrotfish, but I don't know. Maybe we must be pooping that much.
Humans are producing way more than 200 pounds of poop a year, but
and we don't even get a beach out of it.
No, I know. It's what if we just pooped stuff to create beautiful beaches,
Yeah.
Everything would be a beach though, really.
I guess the argument is technically human waste can help fuel nutrients.
That's true.
And all of that, but
yeah, it's
I don't know.
less aesthetically pleasing for sure.
Yeah.
So parrotfish are also not the only animals that poop calcium carbonate. I came across a study when I was just diving into it a little bit more from over a decade ago that found fecal samples from 11 common tropical fish, including barracudas, had a lot of calcium carbonate in their poop. And it appears some worm and oyster species also produce this calcium carbonate poop. That being said, parrotfish seem to produce a lot of it. And it's been estimated that up to 70% of the sand on white sandy beaches in the Caribbean and Hawaii has come from parrotfish poo. So the Caribbean and Hawaii is really where you're finding this. I couldn't tell if it was exclusively or just the most. I think just depending on where parrotfish are, like where their actual habitat is. But in Northwest Florida, there are also white sand beaches, and they do not come from parrotfish poop. They're actually nearly pure quartz,
Whoa.
which eroded from the Appalachian Mountains. So pretty cool stuff.
That's
so yeah,
really
that's my dive into parrotfish poop. Thank you, Dakota.
Wow.
Yeah.
I was like not expecting the quartz.
I
Like,
know.
That's really cool.
That feels very fancy.
Yeah.
Like-
Yeah, those are fancy beaches.
Like Northwest Florida. What?
Yeah.
I'd heard something about this at some point. Like, it's one of those really fun little
Yeah.
factoids that I think gets thrown
Totally.
out a bit, but I didn't realize 70% of the sand on white sandy beaches in the Caribbean and Hawaii come from parrotfish poo.
Yeah. How did they estimate that? Do we know? Like, how? I mean,
Yeah,
someone must know how they came up with that number. But.
Right. I think that stat came from some survey that I found within the like Department of Marine Biology, I think at the University of Hawaii, where they're trying to quantify these things. But yeah, I would assume that if you have a sense of what is the population density of parrotfish in an area, how big are they? How much can we say they're producing? Because we know how much one fish can produce generally.
Yeah.
Can we then make an estimation for how much of that calcium carbonate is showing up on our beaches?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's cool. And it's not a deterrent at all. I think it's really cool.
Yeah.
But now I want to go to the Northwest Florida beaches
Yeah.
that are made of quartz.
Yeah. I feel like the thing that's weird about it to me, this is like a brain thing, is I'm like, the poop sand beaches probably don't hurt your feet and the quartz sand beaches hurt your feet.
That's true.
I don't know if that's true, but that's how my brain reads the situation.
Yeah, because when you're like shredded quartz, but I guess, you know,
Yeah.
if it's rolled around in the ocean for long enough, like
Exactly.
sea glass, I'm sure
Yeah.
it's fine. But if
Yeah.
anyone wants to write in about that, we will read it. So
Yep.
please do.
Tell us about the quartz beaches.
Yeah, do you live in Northwest Florida, and how are those beaches?
Yeah. Okay, so our next tiny show and tell us is from our listener, Mike. I'm just going to read what he wrote,
Yeah.
but when I say I, it's Mike. I used to live in DC, but moved to Colorado a few years ago. When living in DC, I would bike and run with a friend who was always quite a bit faster, but gracious enough to keep my pace. That's a good friend.
Yeah.
After a few years of living in Colorado, he was coming out for a visit. Given that I had ample time to adapt to my mile-high environment, I thought maybe it was time to be the quicker one, or at least keep up. This did not happen. I was still on the struggle bus. Sometime later, my father-in-law was talking about how quickly the body can adapt to changes in altitude, and specifically mentioned how the body produces a molecule called 2,3-BPG to quickly increase the amount of oxygen that red blood cells can deliver to our tissue when going to a higher altitude. I'm pretty sure I would have been outpaced even if my friend didn't have this little molecular helper, but it is fascinating to learn about all the amazing things that are happening in our body and how much scientists have been able to discover.
That's cool.
I mean, totally. Like, I feel like all of these things are like, they're so invisible, and then you're just realizing, oh yeah, this kind of makes a big difference.
Yeah.
And that's something that like was really interesting kind of diving into this. So 2,3-BPG is short for 2,3-bisphosphoglyceric acid. And I hosted Crash Course Organic Chemistry, and so like all of these molecules, I remember like just sitting there for 10 minutes like just being like, I gotta say this again and again and again and again and again to try to get the pronunciation right. And then inevitably like it would come up on the teleprompter and I would be like, mind blank, don't know how to say this word. vowels don't mean anything to me anymore. So anyways, this is fond memories. Okay, so one of the things that 2,3-BPG, which is what I'm going to just call it, can do is regulate the activity of an enzyme by binding to it. And specifically, in this case, what it's doing is regulating the activity of hemoglobin, which is a protein in our red blood cells. It's made up of 4 subunits that bind to oxygen. And there are 2 alpha subunits and there are 2 beta subunits. And one of the things that apparently can happen is that when beta subunits aren't bound to oxygen, they make this nice little pocket for 2,3-BPG to bind to. And that kind of changes the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen overall. So what happens is if you're in a low oxygen environment, 2,3-BPG will bind to those deoxygenated subunits and actually lower its affinity for oxygen. So what that means is that will cause the other subunits to release oxygen. So by lowering the affinity overall, it's like you're releasing oxygen out. So again, because you're in that deoxygenated environment, you are making it so that like your hemoglobin will be more likely to release oxygen to the tissues that need it.
Oh, that's fascinating.
It's really cool. It's like Mike said, it's wild like that there are these little molecular mechanisms that like just work. And so one of the places that this comes up in is at high altitudes. It also goes up with exercise. Also, it goes 2,3-BPG concentrations go up during pregnancy because it's a way to get more oxygen to the fetus.
Yeah.
So
that makes so much sense. It's so smart. It's such a smart adaptation.
Yeah. Like I feel like a lot of these things you're like, well, all I need is the hemoglobin. Like I just need to carry oxygen. And then you realize, no, like this stuff is specially adapted to make it possible to do a bunch of different things.
Yeah. Huh. With all of these kinds of really cool adaptations, it makes me think a lot about how did this come to be? Like what were, I think altitude is an obvious one. I mean, I guess all of these things, right? It's like altitude, pregnancy. For us, we're like exercise, but our ancestors were like exertion because we have to run for things. We're not going to Orange Theory, guys. Like we're hunting for food.
Yeah, for sure. I was also really curious. I don't know if our listeners know this, could probably haven't mentioned it, but I am pregnant, like due in a month from when we're recording this. So the oxygen thing I appreciate because it's hard to breathe. People really undersold to me like how weird breathing becomes very quickly because so much of your oxygen is going to this tiny growing thing. So I do appreciate what little effect. I assume there's a big effect because I assume breathing would have sucked a lot more without the 2,3-BPG. Pregnancy, obviously, you just learn that there's like a bajillion molecules that like suddenly become active that they weren't doing before.
Yeah, hormones are wild and like certain bodily shifts for sure.
Right.
I think this is really fascinating. I think another thing was it seems to be unclear how long this effect lasts. Like, of course, if you're pregnant, the fetus is there, right? But with altitude, it's like you have other adaptations. And like maybe actually when you're pregnant, there are other ones as well. So I wonder how quickly, depending on the circumstance, depending on the environment, like how quickly does this all of a sudden start to kick in, right? If I'm going to go on a run this afternoon, I assume this is going to start kicking in pretty quick. But as soon as I stop, I assume then my body, maybe it's once I get back to a certain heart rate or how much I'm sucking in oxygen. Like what I want to know, what are the little alarm bells that go off to your body where it's like, all right, let's start doing this thing.
Yep. What is like the regulator of the 2,3-BPG concentration in general? What does that feedback mechanism look like? Does it get trained? Obviously, people adapt to different environments. So
It also makes me, this is like a darker path to go down, but it also makes me wonder about certain drug use among the Olympics is coming up. It makes me wonder how some of those drugs that you hear about that do have to somehow deal with oxygen availability, storage, like how does that then impact 2,3-BPG?
Good question.
Right? Like, what is the interplay there? Does some actually increase that? Or is it like something completely different? And then all of a sudden your body is maybe not going to do this thing with 2,3-BPG? I'm going down like a more pessimistic route of like human manipulation.
No, now so I did a very quick Google and there are papers from the 70s about manipulating. Oh no, this is DPG. I don't know what DPG is. Diphosphoglycerate.
Oh no, so it looks like 2,3-BPG is also known as 2,3-DPG.
Okay, so interesting.
Because like bi and di phospho is really the same thing, right?
I should have put that together.
No, I just seeing it written out, I'm like, oh yeah, okay. 2.
So there are papers about this. Let's see. So it seems like scientists have looked at manipulating the concentration. So apparently you can manipulate the concentration of 2,3-BPG with a steroid.
Huh.
Interesting.
Wow, I'm really onto something.
Yeah.
50 years later.
You were about to like peace out from Tiny Matters, you guys. I've got a great idea for athletic performance enhancement drugs.
Oh my God. Just like lose all credibility in 3 seconds.
Well, I'm glad that you had that darker thought because that was interesting to see. It's interesting also to me that all these papers that are coming up on Google are from the 70s. Obviously, who knows if that means anything. Google search results mean so little now.
Yeah, that's true. Again, if someone knows more
if
about
you've taken
this,
steroids.
No, we don't want to be implicated. Please don't send us anything incriminating. But beyond that, if you know things about this, write in.
Mm-hmm.
We want to hear more.
Totally.
Okay, let's wrap up the end of the first one.
Yeah. Oh, that was fun.
Thanks for tuning in to the first Tiny Show and Tell Us, a bonus episode from Tiny Matters, a production of the American Chemical Society. And thank you again to Anne Hilden for her work on this episode.
Send us an email to be featured in a future Tiny Show and Tell Us episode, tinymatters@acs.org. You can find Sam on social at SamJScience, and you can find me at Okidoki Boki. See you next time.